This is the Lexicon Podcast with JP Maxwell. Today, I'm delighted to be joined via the magic of technology all the way across the pond. No crystalmancy or crazy stuff going on here. It's just purely the internet that is bringing us to talk with Daniel Harms, who is the edited and introduced A Complete System of Magic. So a manual of 19th century British cunning man, which itself is a fascinating title. There you go. And there's the book there. Dan, welcome.
Thank you.
So yeah, I think what we'll begin with is obviously a link with Liverpool, and this podcast itself has got a sort of a hook into Liverpool and Liverpool history. So that's one of the reasons why I'm fascinated in the subject of this book. The centre of a gentleman called William Dawson Bellhouse, or a self-proclaimed professor, as we'll get onto in a bit. But can you tell us how you came about this fascinating work?
So I'd gotten interested in texts of magic, first of all, sort of informally, and then sort of as part of my master's thesis work in anthropology, and then I pursued it further from there. And so one of the things you do with that is you start looking around for available sources of manuscripts. And I'm in the States, so there's not much. We are missing several centuries of time in which people could have accumulated that material. But I did find out that there was a magic box at the New York Public Library. And they've gotten more formal about this. But at the time, it was indeed a box. They had a box of books and, like some weird amulet and also some Houdini letters and things like that. And they would just give you the box. So I went through that box, and one of the items I found in there was actually William Dawson Bellhouse's manuscript. I think it was bought by the library at about 1910. I'm not sure how exactly it got from Liverpool to New York, but it was probably one of the most intriguing items in that box. And I said, maybe I should look into this a little bit more. And at the time, I didn't really understand the significance of it, because we don't have very many practical manuals of cunning folk or magicians who are working with this sort of magic dating from the 19th century. We have a good number of people who are collecting, it seems, or who are creating manuscripts for others. And there was a network of this, but I think that a lot of the manuscripts just did not survive. And so this was particularly interesting because it provided, evidence of somebody who was actually interested in this material and seemed to be using it.
That's it's interesting in itself, isn't it? That some might say, and I might use that expression a few times in this podcast. Some might say that it survived for a reason. There's some kind of supernatural means that the book is sort of stuck with us. It almost has the makings of a Hollywood film, really. Particularly, in finding this book, and it's got some kind of mythical sort of power that you've attached yourself to.
I do have a very funny coincidence attached to this book, because I was working in New York Public Library, and I had the book out in front of me, and I was also on my computer, taking notes, and I was on Facebook, and a publisher friend of mine wrote me and said, "Hey, we're putting together a book about fairies, and fairies in magic, and we'd like you to write a chapter." And I'm like, well, I think there are better people suited for this. Maybe I'll think about it. And then I looked down and I saw in the Bellhouse manuscript the name Sibylla, who is one of the chief fairies that turns up in magical manuscripts. And I said, okay, well, I guess I should be doing this now. That was a nice opportunity and coincidence.
A message from the beyond. I mean, what interests me from reading it and looking at some of the the works and that. You have brought it back to life. There's a sense of almost kind of necromancy going on with this, but what fascinates me is that I know this about in a kind of the view of the occult on any kind of level is actually it's not kind of it's more to it than meets the eye in so many ways, and there are cultural reasons, there are sociological reasons, there are psychological reasons that are attached to works of this kind. It's not just a kind of idea of let's summon some spirits up and have a party. It's actually that there's a thinking behind it, which is even to this day, among many people have got a merit. Have you latched onto that audience? Is that an audience that you're particularly interested in yourself?
In terms of the modern audience?
Yeah, in terms of the modern audience.
Yeah. I mean, they buy a lot of my books. I'm very, I'm happy to talk to them. I don't engage too much just because I find that over the past, say, 200 years, occultism has completely changed. That means like everything from magic to alchemy to astrology. It's a completely different system. And what I've had to do when I'm studying these older books, which is I'm kind of been specializing in books from like 16th to the 19th century, the manuscripts and the printed works of ritual magic, is I have to sort of disattach from that because I've already spent so much of my time because I, got into whatever I could find when I was younger, in terms of these books. I've had to disattach myself because it brings in all sorts of assumptions that are not necessarily the case. These books are based in a very different sort of worldview. It's, in a very different sort of societal attitude about magic and also religion and all sorts of other topics. And so, I like having conversations with people, but I'm also, there's a little bit of a separation there that I like to maintain.
So I think, kind of boiling it down to this, it could be what is fascinating as much as the book itself is fascinating and the way you've written you really introduced it well, as Dr. Phil Leggett, who's my colleague from Leeds, which in American terms is around the corner from us. It's just just over the way. Here it just seems like much further. But both of you really have kind of set the scene really for the book. But can you tell us about WD Bellhouse himself? What his story and how in a kind of nutshell, because I know most of this is in the book, so I'm not spoiling it so much, but can you give us a sort of taster of who this man was and what drove him?
Well, let's see. I'd say William Dawson Bellhouse. I'm going to be a little imprecise on dates, unfortunately, because I have to recall them from the top of my head. He was born around 1814. He died about 1870. He lived in Topsail for a while, but started becoming prominent in Leeds, where he opened up a coffee shop. He moved to Liverpool in about 1851, and that's where he seems to have. That's where we know the most about him. He became very involved in advertising his galvanic treatments. This was still at the stage where electricity was sort of mysterious and no one really, knew exactly what the health benefits were. And so he was one of those people who, as his respectable job, would electrocute people for money. And then at about 1856 or 1857, he heads back to Leeds, and that's where he spends the rest of his life. Still pursuing his galvanic experiments and treatments of people. He also has this other aspect of him, which hasn't shown up much in the historical record, that this book kind of fills in some gaps for, in terms of his interest in astrology and magic and things of that sort. Which he did employ to some extent alongside his other practices. This was actually fairly common for what we call cunning folk or service magicians, was that they would, pursue that often part-time, and then have some sort of more sort of quote respectable day job. In which case, so he would offer these services to clients. So that's mainly a lot of what we know about him.
And what kind of hit me straight away on first hearing about Bellhouse is actually where he chose to put his HQ, his base. And there are a number of different ways to describe that. You could describe it as a sort of surgery or as a place of operation. But where he put it, because I actually work minutes away from this spot, I know is actually the centre of the medical community in Liverpool, and it has been for a long, long time. Since Liverpool became really populous and right there you've got what is now the School of Tropical Medicine, which is a world famous school. It is actually built on the spot where he had his base. So can you tell me a little bit about how acceptable it was at the time, how seriously his work was taken?
It's really, it's hard to tell. I mean, he had a good address. He apparently had clients who were fairly wealthy, actually a good span of clients, but some of them were wealthy. He was practicing something for which he did not actually have a degree. We don't actually know how long he was practicing it because his story differs from time to time. He was successful enough that he actually could open up an office in Southport. And so I think he was seeing some degree of success. I don't see a great deal of material before Hugh Schuman's article after he left Liverpool that suggests that he was in any sort of questionable circumstances. I think there was one matter of an inquest where a woman had passed away and she had visited him slightly before, but nothing really came out of that. But yeah, nobody seems to have made much of a stink about what he was doing, really, until the very end.
I mean, just to kind of explain to the listeners that Hugh Schuman was, I suppose, an investigative reporter of the time, wasn't he? He was connected with the Liverpool Mercury, and he was known for he was very outspoken on many issues. I mean, the name sticks around here, even So, what was his beef with Bellhouse?
So I think at this point there had been a major trial of the gentleman's name was Harrison, involving a cunning person named Harrison who had basically read to a Mr. Dove a article while he was basically helping him out with some ill luck on his farm. So this had been an ongoing situation where Mr. Harrison had going back to the farm repeatedly, and they got to know each other. And at one point, Harrison read him Dove a newspaper article about a man who had killed his wife with strychnine, and Dove wasn't too fond of his wife, and so he did the same, except that he kept talking about it to everyone. So this created a sort of press sensation.
Dear devil, if he will get me clear of these diseases, and let me have the enjoyment of life, health, wealth, tobacco, beer, more food, and better my wishes granted, and live till I am 60, come to me and tell me. I remain your faithful subject, William Dove.
Harrison was not. I don't think Harrison was charged at that point. He was later charged with bigamy down the line. But it did kind of bring to people's attention that, hey, we still had these service magicians, going around and serving people. And maybe that's not something we want to do in a, rationalist society. So Hugh wrote a series of articles about the various people in Liverpool who were doing all this. And this was actually thanks to a friend of mine that I found this, because he said he was looking for material like this, sort of give some more context to what we were talking about with this book at the time. And he told me, oh yeah, I found these newspaper articles by Hugh Schumann, and I think this is actually Bellhouse is the feature of one of them. Written shortly after Bellhouse had left town, but it is quite the fascinating article, because Bellhouse was apparently very popular. He actually was sort of combining mechanics with magic. If you went to the door of Bellhouse's surgery, it would spring open, so you didn't have to wait on the street. And the people would come into his waiting room, and they could spend some time there. And he'd also hooked up a battery to the door handle of his office or his consulting room, so that if you went over to it early, and people are just like, well, I'll just go in a little bit early, then they would get a little bit of electric shock. And apparently this led to some people to think that he was in league with the devil, supposedly. I think Hugh sat him down and actually was able to get him to talk a little bit about the practice, and also was able to get him to open up a little bit about his crystal gazing practices, and get him to say some incriminating things. Then Bellhouse left town. I mean, he was already in some sort of legal trouble because of a lawsuit that had happened previously. So I don't know how much knowing that there was going to be a newspaper story about him really affected his practice or his decision to go back to Leeds. But it was, this was part of the mix at the time.
I know certainly there was an obsession with scandal back then, and reputation and so forth, and that was kind of in line with the notion of being ruined. All these expressions are very sort of synonymous with Victorian, the Victorian existence, especially perceived as being a gentleman. He obviously, by giving himself I think he gave himself this. You correct me if I'm wrong, Dan. The title of Professor, is that right?
Mm-hmm. I think he was a doctor for a while as well, until the medical community started cracking down on that. So he just tended to pick up, what titles he thought would be impressive, and that would nonetheless not get him in trouble for using.
Yeah, maybe not quite as tight as it is these days in terms of. But what does fascinate me is this again, where he was based. It sort of leans towards him wanting this kind of respectability, wanting to be taken seriously. Even looking through the book, he does reference. He references what he's talking about, so there is a sort of form of academic sort of qualifications for everything he's doing.
Yeah. I mean, some of these, even if you look at the magic, some of this magic is from the 17th century. I mean, that's mainly where a lot of my focus is, because, as I said, we don't get a lot of later period manuscripts necessarily. Yeah. So he does have some very interesting material that's from that time, from centuries before, that he's copied down here. I think I mentioned that Sibylla spell, the one that mentions the fairy queen briefly. It's kind of a wax image rite that one does to, when one's been bewitched. You just make or it's for theft. There's different versions. I'm not sure which one Bellhouse used, but you make a wax image and you put it by the fire, and it's kind of, but not in the fire. And you just let it melt, and it's supposed to, have an impact on the other person. This is pretty common in the 17th century. There are so many examples of it. And then it just falls off completely. You don't see it again. And then it's in Bellhouse. So he was apparently parts of, networks of people who were circulating these manuscripts and, copying them for their own purposes.
Wow. It is an incredible find, I have to say, because, I think part of it is not just the text itself, it's actually the way you've discovered it, and the way. How long ago did you actually find it?
Oh gosh, probably 15 years at least.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
And it's a piece of work to actually. Is it edited from a point of view of, from the original text? Have you kind of have you done anything with it in terms of, because I know you've said it says that you've edited it and introduced it. So to what extent did you edit it and kind of retranscribe the whole thing?
I've it took a bit of work. I'm thinking in terms of some of my other books, which are 600-page monstrosities. But so in that sense, not so much. But it was going through, making sure it was annotated, talking about where the various spells and incantations came from, what seems to be unique, what seems to be what he copied from other sources. He had a whole section of material that was in Latin, and one thing I definitely know about Bellhouse is that he did not know Latin at all. So it would just seem to be in a hurry too. So he was just, and he was copying as best I could tell out of printed work, but he went very quickly, made a lot of errors. So I tried to go back through and clean that up, and that was a lot of work. Yeah, so there was some effort involved in this. I think that he said he was never very successful with those incantations, and I said, well, maybe you should have spent more time copying them. That would have been a good start, at least. Regardless of whether or not they work, you want to make sure your Latin is correct.
I mean, to what extent was Bellhouse a sort of singular character? I know you mentioned potential cohorts, through the Hugh Shimon sort of reporting and so forth, but it's interesting that the timing of all this, because I mean, it's sort of mid-industrial revolution. It's kind of at its apex. You've got huge diaspora coming into the city of Liverpool and going on to New York, actually. So maybe that's how the book actually made it across on some ship once or something.
Yeah.
Like that. But you've got this wave of immigration. You've got this wave of technology, to use a modern term. But so as we said at the top of this podcast, he represents the old world, does Bellhouse in some way, but perhaps marrying it to maybe trying to find a place for all of these things, for magic in against the current the contemporary sort of thinking. So to what extent was he on his own? Was he trying to kind of forge a path by himself, or did he have cohorts? Did he have contemporaries who were not just in the city, I suppose, but further afield?
He did have contemporaries, and quite a number of them. I think Shimon actually quotes him at one point. They basically say he was a terrible astrologer. So,
okay.
But this is an interesting time because, there is there's a growing, education is becoming more important, but at the same time, there's serious sort of gaps. Modern policing is just starting. Modern healthcare for all is still, very much it just doesn't exist for a lot of people. They can't access, how to say reputable doctors in what we would call today. So there is still this place where people can, Bellhouse can operate, and there still are networks. They're becoming more urban. There is a sort of fall off in some activities just because these people were mainly aimed at, sort of had their skill set and this incantation set that was useful for if you were out in the countryside. So that aspect of the profession is falling away. But there's still a good number of people who are, serving these sort of gaps in the social structure through magical practice. And of course, there's still widespread belief in witchcraft and people who can harm each other magically. And there's not really, ever since, the sort of Witchcraft Act switch over in 1735 from viewing witchcraft itself as a crime to witchcraft as fraud. So there's not, if someone believes that they're under supernatural attack, they don't really have an official avenue to deal with that. And so that's another area where people like Bellhouse would come in.
Right. With giving it a sort of air of respectability and a few airs and graces and, a professional title and so forth, it kind of goes in line with, the way the mainstream medical profession was going, I would guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think go ahead.
No, you go ahead. That's fine.
I'm not sure where I was going. It's okay.
Yeah. I think, he's such a fascinating character. One thing I noticed recently, was the original site of the women's hospital, again, not too far away from where Bellhouse's operation was in the city. There's actually in the current hospital, there's the original stone that they moved when they moved across town, but the women's infirmary, as it was very close to where Bellhouse was. And I know through in and around this, he notoriously supplied aborticants to sex workers at the time. To use a modern term, but he was. Why did he have this sort of what? I know you've mentioned the kind of relationship in terms of his clientele being, often quite well-to-do people at the time, but was there a relationship with the other sides of society, and if so, what was the nature of it?
That's something I don't know quite as much about. It may be that you have some sources that I'm not familiar with, but that's okay. I do get the impression that he was serving a lot of people in a lot of different capacities, though. What you've described to me would not surprise me at all. I mean, I think he was very much sort of in touch with, a lot of different people. It was a very, dynamic population. And his particular skill set seems to have extended to things like, trying to figure out where, people who had, sailors who had vanished, or hadn't come home, where exactly they'd gone and things like that. So, I think I think he used different sorts of, different approaches for different groups of people. Once again, making his electrocuting people for treatment being his respectable profession, and then maybe doing some other things on the side. Hopefully after he got someone into his room and could actually talk to them.
And it's interesting in terms of his belief system, because there's a fair amount of work that's gone into this from yourself, obviously, but also getting into the meat of it from Bellhouse himself, and you see it come from different angles, like you've mentioned, crystalmancy, a certain amount of soothsaying, I suppose, they're trying to predict the future, and there are different forms of magic that go into it. Now, to what extent, I know it, there are different types of charlatans, put it that way. If you want to kind of go down the Hugh Shimmin route and say this guy was a charlatan, you can always argue about that one, because it'd be interesting to do that. But did he kind of know that he was sort of bending people's faith a little bit, or was he a firm believer in his own powers?
Well, let's see. The tricky part about this is, we've got, first of all, the book. He doesn't actually come out. His voice does not come forward much in the book, but you can see what he's interested in. And he does seem to be, the man copied page after page of Latin incantations he couldn't understand. There's a certain level of devotion to that. The other piece we know is that what he actually told Shimmin, and of course we're getting that through a particular lens, but he does seem to have been sincere about some aspects of his practice. He did try to summon spirits, doing the whole thing with the circle and the incantations and all of that. He didn't have a lot of success with that, according to Shimmin. And I don't think that's the sort of thing, it doesn't seem to be the sort of thing you tell people when you really want to impress them. But So there's a certain sincerity in there. He was using crystalmancy fairly often, it sounds like, in his practice. He was also using it to touch the knees of young women, I think, which was is not necessarily something that really speaks to your sincerity in doing something. I think that maybe there were some mixed purposes there going on. That's not a standard part of crystal gazing incantations.
I mean, I suppose also, you are using mixed sources here, but you came across the main source, which was from the horse's mouth, really, through New York Public Library. But trying to pull together newspaper articles, and I've read stuff there, that kind of connects that, where he was with other parts of Liverpool society at the time. So, I'm certainly thinking from a Liverpool point of view, there's a big part of the story that goes on in Leeds, of course, and in Yorkshire and in Southport. But just going from knowing this city as I do, and knowing that, it was a sort of centre, it was a hub for this, particularly this part of the city. It was right in the middle of the medical community. Suggests to me that he wanted to be taken seriously, but put in the position of power, like many of us. And again, you have to read between the lines up to a point, but put in a position of trust and power, that would be open to abuse, as it were.
Yeah. I think that, this is what he tells Shimon. So is Shimon being completely accurate? I think Shimon is generally well regarded. It's also a question about whether he's just boasting about, his prowess to somebody. It's hard to tell. He was never. There are definitely cases of cunning people who were basically trying use their position to try to get sexual favors out of people. Right. There were no charges against Bellhouse from that, but it would have been. I could see it happening.
Just to kind of define this word cunning too, because I think it's got a very clear sort of context in what you're talking about, but it's different slightly from the way we'd use that word now. So can you just give us a bit of an insight into what you mean by the expression cunning?
Yeah. So when I'm talking about cunning folk or cunning men or cunning women, we're talking about people who were using magic in service to their community. So they're very much enmeshed in these local networks, and they're serving a function within it. We're not talking about necessarily people who are intellectually interested in the occult or people who are high class. A lot of these people are sort of at the artisan level or the merchant level. They have a second job, and what they do is they do, as part of what they do, they serve the community in providing astrology and spell work for the people in around them. Some of them were quite famous. Some of them were, barely leave a blip on the historical record. But it was very much part of the sort of life of England for much of its history. Just having people who could do this. Cunning folk are particularly set apart from other practitioners in that they're mainly using written sources for their work, and also that they provide a variety of services. They're not just doing fortune telling. They're not just doing astrology. They're doing maybe fortune telling, astrology, and finding treasure and finding lost goods and dealing with evil spells and all this sort of thing. That's usually sort of they have sort of a wide remit in terms of what they're doing.
Yeah, it was an age where people wanted that. People want answers now, but back then, as you said, electricity was something that was still a mysterious force, and that was at the forefront of much of what he did. He could use that as a way of dazzling people in a way.
Yes, he definitely could. And he was very successful. He was actually exhibiting his devices. He did a publication on his devices to talk, kind of advertise them. It was mainly ripped off from other people, but he still published it. And he was he was active when he went back to Leeds in local politics. And, so he was actually finding some degree of social acceptance. And I think that, which I would not have necessarily expected from the book itself, but then you start to get into some of the historical material and you see how he fit in with everyone. And, there seemed to be a level of respect for him in the local community. Well, more in Leeds, though, I think. Liverpool, I think it was a little bit more rocky for him.
Again, a feature of Liverpool at the time was, and I've called it in my books, I've called it a viper pit, because it was quite a sort of cutthroat sort of place in many ways, even though it was, pound for pound, one of the richest cities on the planet. What the stupid thing is, it wasn't actually a city at the time. It was it was bigger than it is now, which sounds crazy, and it is called a city now, but it was called a town. But it was just a throbbing metropolis. So I think you could live or die as a business very, very quickly. And it was the highs and lows of someone like that really doing something that was speculative. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. It didn't help that I think in one of the incidents that came to make him leave was actually he had the office in Southport and he was going to move everything there. He rented out his house in Liverpool to a lady. Then his Southport venture didn't work out. So he's like, well, I need to get her out of the house. So he changed the lease and then sold some of her furniture. And this all went to court. And this is where the astrology actually comes up. Now, people could be prosecuted for fraud for astrology, but it was interesting to see how they went about it in court. So first of all, he had never cast a horoscope for this lady. So he was free and clear on that count with regard to the procedure before the court. And then his lawyer apparently, what we in the States would call a lawyer, basically presented it all as, well, okay, if people are dumb enough to go see him and get their horoscope, done, then that's not really his problem, is it? Which was an unusual defense, but, I also kind of see why he may have decided that, Liverpool was getting too hot after that and decided to leave. Once that something like that comes out in open court, maybe it's time to leave town.
Yeah, it was sort of the nature of the beast, really, by the sound of things. Yeah. And, again, so much of this is, it's reading between the lines, isn't it? It's looking at, what we could potentially pen together, because it was so long ago and you've almost done enough to kind of bring this guy back to life after all this time, So not just crystalmancy, but necromancy, in an academic way, of course. Unless you're doing something that you haven't mentioned in this book, but I won't get into that.
I'm gonna leave Bellhouse alone. I think he deserves some rest.
Just one last thing, and I don't want at the risk of making this sound like a sort of afterthought about him, but you did mention to me the story of his wife too, and you said that she was an interesting character. Can you tell me a little bit? Was it Mary his wife?
I believe her name was Mary, and we don't know too much about Mary. She is very much in the background. What we do know is that she was a partner with him in the business. So when they would go to people's houses to perform galvanic treatments, he would go see the men, she would go see the women. And so it was something that she was very much sort of a partner in terms of the, in that, at least that aspect of the business. I don't see any sort of sign of her in the book itself. I know they also did not have any children, but she seems to have been trying to help him out and help make him successful.
Right. Well, I'm sure one way or the other there was a very interesting story behind Mary too. Just to kind of because this podcast will be going out to students too, and future researchers, academics, and so forth. Just to kind of let us know, what's next for you, Dan, and where this book stands in terms of your field of interest, your field of study. Are you continuing in this sort of vein? But where are you going next?
Well, most of my field of study is the 16th to the 19th century and magical manuscripts within it. I've also written another book available on Amazon, which is on George and Margaret Graham, the mainly known for crashing their balloons a lot. They were also involved in some of the same things that Bellhouse was doing. I'm mainly moving toward like the 16th and 17th century because that's where a lot of the evidence is of what people were doing in terms of like the actual text. But I'm willing to let myself be guided by what I find. One of the great things about this is that people are starting to realize that the manuscripts of magic are actually worth something, and they have something to say about society, and they have something to say about how people live their lives. And so all of the librarians who spent decades cataloging these and thinking they were just trash and ridiculous, are now we're starting to revisit that, and so that means that more manuscripts are coming to our attention. So I'm going to be led by that. I think I keep an eye out for new discoveries and see if I can kind of fit them in as pieces of this overall puzzle, which is very much fun.
Sounds fascinating. It also sounds like one aspect of history is that history evolves itself, doesn't it, as a subject? And the way we look at it and the way what we take seriously, and sometimes it's the great things are hidden in plain sight, and I think you've certainly found something here in Bellhouse, and it sounds like your other work as well, which is giving us an insight into these eras.
Absolutely. And if anyone has any ideas for further sources about Bellhouse and ways to find out some aspects of which things we don't know. I mean, that's the tricky about history. You get like these little bits of people's lives, unless they've written an autobiography themselves. And sometimes you have to sort of tie them together. But, and you do the best you can to read between the lines. But, if I would love to know more about Bellhouse and, what kind of a person he was, and, but that's not mediated by the courts or, reporters or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in a sense, that's what I do. I because I'm a fictional novelist, I read between the lines, and because the guy's been dead for 170 years, he can't come back and sue me. So that's kind of that's it's fortunate, I suppose, from that point of view. Well, lastly, to see where listeners can get hold of your book. Where can they get it?
The book is currently available in paperback at the Troy Books website. I believe they also have distribution at various bookshops in the UK. But you can actually, I'd prefer people get it from Troy Books directly and support them. They're a small publisher. They do a lot of interesting work on folklore and magic, and it might be good to check it out at their site, buy it there, and maybe see if there's anything else you'd like to pick up.
I'll be sure to put a link alongside this podcast that people can access. Daniel, thank you so much for joining us. That was fascinating, really, really interesting, and please keep us up to date with your future work too.
All right, thank you.
All the best.
I guess we could have brought in the bit about the Leeds coffee house, but he's running a gambling den in the back of his coffee house, and the police sergeant shows up at 4 a.m. and tries to get in, and he won't let him in. That doesn't really. That's just another Bellhouse anecdote. It's not really anything that was substantive.
He's running a gambling den. I think, yeah, he's an interesting guy, isn't he?
Yeah.
He's running a gambling den and supplying aborticants to local prostitutes. I think he's just he did things his way, for better or worse.
Yes.
I mean, you could say supplying aborticants to local prostitutes could be seen as I don't know. He thought he was doing some good, maybe. Or maybe it was a side hustle.
There,
You know, who
it's hard to
knows?
tell. Yeah, yeah.
Because
It's
he was he was quite the entrepreneur, although obviously his business dealings ultimately led to, you know, ruin, really. But
hmm hmm
he was an interesting guy. You know, looking at your book and from what I've found, yeah, I certainly, as I said before, I certainly want to write about him. You know, but put him in a sort of fictional context, and obviously, I will reference you and kind of and credit you.
Yeah.
You know, for what you've found, because it's absolutely extraordinary, really.
That would be great. Yeah. It's nice to be able to bring people like him to life again, in a sense.
So then, a strange, cunning man called William Dawson Bellhouse opened up his practice in Liverpool, specialising in electric baths and crystalmancy, with a side hustle in gambling dens and amateur pharmacology. He vanished for over 170 years before Dan Harms found him again in the archives of New York Public Library. You can find Dan's edition of Bellhouse's Grimoire at troybooks.co.uk. Check out my historical thrillers at jpmaxwellwriter.art.blog. That's all for now. Tune in soon for another Lexicon. I've been JP Maxwell. Who were you?